This video is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com, the best online retailer for Magic the Gathering singles and sealed product, and GatheringMagic.com, the #1 source for Magic the Gathering news and content. Now it's time for our latest video with Alan Pennington.
Hello guys, today's deck primer is on the blue-red Splinter Twin deck for Modern. Splinter Twin is a pretty big force in the metagame. It's been around for a while, and this particular build has actually gotten a first and a second place at 2 different Grand Prix, so definitely a deck that you should be respecting even if you're not playing it. This particular build is often called Tempo Twin because, as you would imagine, it is quite tempo-based. We've got cards like Lightning Bolt, Remand, Snapcaster Mage, things that aren't really dedicated to the combo, but serve to either buy yourself extra time by killing creatures, or sometimes you can just attack for some damage with your flyers and then push through the extra damage with your burn. Lavamancer too, of course. So this is a combo deck, but it's not really combo dependent. There will definitely be a fair bit of games, even as much as like half of them, where you're actually not going to win by comboing at all. You're just going to either try to win an attrition battle or just sort of take the more control approach where you answer your opponent's threats with removal and counter spells and then get one of your win conditions in play. Just one of your flyers would work. So the deck does have multiple lines to victory, which is, I know, something that a lot of people will appreciate. As far as the actual card choices go, we're playing a pretty stock list, but I'll go ahead and explain why all the cards are there. To take it from the top, we've got Stomping Ground, and that is just in there because we have Ancient Grudge in our sideboard, so that is splashed in for the flashback on our Ancient Grudge. And then we've got our 8 blue fetches. Scalding Tarn gets every land in our deck, essentially gets Basic Island and Basic Mountain, gets Steam Vents, and it gets Stomping Ground. Misty Rainforest gets all the same cards, but it doesn't get Basic Mountain. And then we've got, of course, 4 Steam Vents, and we've got the next best blue-red duel, which is Sulfur Falls. Then we've got our basics. Then we've got Desolate Lighthouse to allow us to filter some of our draws in the later game. And then we've got Tech Edge, which is another one of these tempo cards. The deck can have some problem with manlands, particularly large Raging Ravines once they get out of Lightning Bolt range. So it is good to have a way to get rid of some of those manlands. And if they stumble on mana, we might be able to cut off one of their sources. We do also board in Molten Rains in some matchups, so depending on how the games play out, you can steal some wins just by keeping them off of lands. Then we've got the best 1-mana cantrip with Serum Visions. Unfortunately, Preordain and Ponder are banned in Modern, so we've got to go with Serum Visions. Card's not insane, but it does give the deck a little bit more consistency. Then we've got Lightning Bolt, arguably the best removal spell in Modern. Doesn't deal with everything, but it's very efficient and it goes to the face, which can be quite helpful in some games. We've got the Miser's Peak. It might seem weird that we are playing this card over Gitaxian Probe, but the instant speed turns out to be pretty relevant, especially with Snapcaster Mage. We often like to play Snapcaster Mage on their end step rather than on my turn. So Peak is alright. It's just kind of the 60th card in the deck, and being able to get a peek at their hand and see if it's okay to combo off or not is nice. Grim Lavamancer is quite strong. With all of our fetch lands and cantrips, it's quite easy to feel the ability. It does have somewhat of a non-bow with Snapcaster Mage, but the card is still very good. It's one of those things where if you play it on turn 1 off of a fetch, they have to deal with it, because if they follow up with a Deathrite or something, you can just play either a cantrip or another fetch and just kill it. So in a lot of matchups, it really is a must-answer threat, which is good. It can soak up a removal spell early on, so that way they don't have it for when we play our Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch, for example. Izzet Charm's just here for flexibility reasons. We don't often use the draw 2 and discard 2 ability, but the fact that it can be a counterspell or a removal spell is pretty sweet. Not really good enough to want to play more than 2, but it is nice in a few situations. Then we've got Remand here. It's a very classic tempo card. Sets them back a turn and lets you draw. Always welcome. Good once Snapcaster Mage gets thrown in the mix too. You can remand their spell and then Snapcaster remand it again and draw cards while keeping them off of their threats, which leads right into Snapcaster Mage. Very good with Remand, very good with Lightning Bolt. Also pretty good with Serum Visions. Sometimes you can even flashback something a little more expensive like Electrolyze and Cryptic Command. But Snapcaster is definitely one of the stronger cards in the deck, and it's one of the only sources of card advantage, so it's quite important. Then we have Electrolyze, which can potentially be a 3-for-1 if we kill 2 creatures with it and draw a card. It's actually very good in the mirror. As you would expect, it's good against any deck that has a lot of 1 and 2 power creatures, which there are a fair number of. And sometimes just going to the face for 2 and drawing a card can be reasonable as well. And then we've got our combo pieces here, our combo creatures, Deceiver Exarch and Pestermite. They're largely the same, it's just a question of whether you value a 1/4 without flying or a 2/1 with flying. Deceiver Exarch used to get the nod just on the basis of the fact that it didn't die to Lightning Bolt, but now that we're actually less combo based, we like Pestermite better just because it hits harder and has flying. If you want, you could try something like a 3-3 split, but the Pestermite I have found to be pretty good. And then our last 3-mana creature is Vendilion Clique, arguably one of the strongest cards in Modern. Sees play in a lot of different decks. All of the abilities are relevant, flash, flying, and getting to look at their hand. Just a very solid card overall, and I don't think you could really consider playing this deck without Vendilion Clique, because it is one of the best standalone cards in the deck. And as far as other good standalone cards go, we do have Cryptic Command, one of the best counterspells of all time. It is 4 mana, so it is a little expensive for the format, and we really don't want to be playing more than 2, but it is good in quite a few of the matchups, I would say. And of course we have the other combo piece, Splinter Twin. Pretty straightforward what that's for. Occasionally though, you can put it on something like a Snapcaster Mage and just start making copies and flashing back all your spells. Or with the new Legend rule, you can even do it on Vendilion Clique, and then in each of their draw steps get to look at their hand. So it's mainly there for comboing with Exarch and Pestermite, but it does have a couple of other niche uses as well. Moving on to the sideboard, we've got Ancient Grudge, which is, of course, the most efficient artifact hate spell. If you don't want to splash Stomping Ground or just like Shatterstorm better, that's another option, but I think in this sort of tempo-oriented build, we really want cards that are cheap, which is why Ancient Grudge gets the nod over Shatterstorm. Also on the board, we've got one of the newer additions from Theros, Anger of the Gods. It's quite good as far as mass removal goes, because cards like Kitchen Finks, Murderous Redcap, Voice of Resurgence all see play. There might even be like a couple of Undying creatures. I think there might be like a mono black deck that plays Geralf's Messenger, for example. So the fact that it exiles it does turn out to be pretty important. Anger just mainly comes in against all of the aggro decks, various things like Zoo, even Affinity also. Anger of the Gods is pretty solid against them. We also have Batterskull, just for some of the decks that don't really have many ways to kill it. Good against Jund, because their only permanent out is Maelstrom Pulse. Also good against aggressive things like Zoo or even Burn. It does cost 5 mana, so Burn might kill you before then, but if you do get to resolve it and not die, then gaining 4 life a turn is obviously a very big game. Then we've got Dismember. This is just kind of one of the random one-ups I threw in here and wasn't sure how good it would be. But I figure there are some cases where there are going to be creatures that Lightning Bolt doesn't kill, and you're going to want to have answers for those. It kills Spellskite, which is important. It can kill opposing Deceiver Exarchs, which is important. It can kill Turbogoyfs most of the time, which is important. Next we have Dispel, which is actually one of my favorite counter spells in general in Standard. My current Standard deck actually plays 2 in the sideboard. And it's really good. I'd consider even boarding a second one for this deck if you want to make room. Countering Instants for 1 mana is definitely great, especially in this tempo style deck where playing cards that are cheap are very important to us. It's also good when we're flashing it back with Snapcaster. There are even a couple of builds of this deck that I think even play 1 Dispel in the main, so that just kind of comes in against, you know, all the decks you'd expect, decks that have a lot of instants that aren't Abrupt Decay, because of course you can't counter that. Things like Zoo with their Bolt, Helix, and Path, things like the Mirror, other control decks, so pretty much what you'd expect. Then we have Molten Rain, mainly against Tron, also good against opposing Splinter Twin decks, opposing control decks, really anything that's trying to cast expensive cards. We also got a Miser's Relic of Progenius here. Can come in against Malaria Pod, given that their infinite combo does usually involve the grave. It comes in against some fringe strategies like the Gristlebrand combo deck or Living End, things like that. Spellskite, mainly there for 2 important matchups, one of which is the Mirror. It does stop the Splinter Twin combo, and in the Mirror it can redirect Lightning Bolts. And also good against Jund, because it can redirect an Abrupt Decay, which allows you to combo off. It can redirect a Lightning Bolt, and both of those interactions against Jund are pretty key. And then last but not least, we have one of my favorite sideboard cards in Modern, which is Threads of Disloyalty. Can be a blowout against things like Jund, really any deck with Tarmogoyf. It's fine against Zoo decks as well, just taking their random 2-3 or their Goyf or what have you. I also feel like Threads is very good in a tempo strategy. A 3-mana control magic is really big game. So that covers every choice. As far as matchups go, given that we are largely a combo deck, the good matchups are decks that don't have a lot of ways to interact with us. The main one, which is Tron. Game 1, they're at complete mercy to the Splinter Twin combo. Post-board, they will often bring in things like Nature's Claim or Combust, so it gets a little worse, but then post-board we have our Molten Rains for them as well. So I'd say Tron is definitely one of your better matchups. Another good matchup is all of the Birthing Pod variants. They're a combo deck too, but I would say on average we kill faster than they do. We do have ways to interact with them. We do have the Lightning Bolts to kill key creatures. Grim Lavamancer is also quite strong against Pod. So is Electrolyze. But on the other hand, they really don't have any ways to interact with us. Some Pod decks do main a couple of Abrupt Decays, which is something you might have to watch out for. But I would say that Tron and Pod are both good. On the other hand, I don't like a lot of the control matchups. Just decks with tons of removal. Mid-range decks like Jund aren't particularly good. So it's just one of the things where the more removal they have, the harder a lot of your matchups are. Like blue-white-red control would be something I'd not want to play against at all, because they're largely just a better version of our deck. Our combo is pretty fragile against them, and they of course have an extra color for things like Path and Sphinx's Revelation, so that can be a pretty difficult one. Affinity is a pretty close matchup, I think. We do have a few relevant sideboard cards to bring in against them, with the Ancient Grudge and the Anger of the Gods. But Affinity is largely just a combo mirror, and they do have ways to interact with us sometimes. Galvanic Blast can even kill a Deceiver Exarch. So I think Affinity can be pretty tricky, especially if we're playing against a good pilot. So I'd say like the Mirror and Affinity are about even. We're both going off on roughly the same turn. The mid-range and control matchups are a little tricky. whereas the aggro and the slower combo matchups are pretty good. In general, I'd say that the good matchups are quite good, and the bad matchups don't feel unwinnable. So I think that this deck definitely has potential to win a few matches in this daily.